Sarah Hanneken is an attorney specializing in litigation and legislation impacting animals. As a legal advocacy counsel at Animal Equality, Sarah pursues strategic impact litigation and legislative initiatives to protect the interests of animals, particularly those that are used in agriculture. Sarah uses her creativity and extensive advocacy experience to develop novel legal strategies specifically designed to shift people's perceptions of the species whom society currently treats as mere commodities. By highlighting animals' individuality in highly publicized court cases, and by utilizing the theory of change methodology in the pursuit of more animal-friendly laws and regulations, Sarah contributes to the pursuit of more animal-friendly laws and regulations. Oh, sorry, I skipped over that. Let me start again. Sarah contributes to the animal protections movement efforts to achieve a social paradigm shift for lasting animal protection and respect. Prior to joining Animal Equality, Sarah worked for 4.5 years at the litigation program at Animal Legal Defense Fund, where she honed her skills as a litigator and activist. Outside of work, Sarah serves on the board of directors at Faunalytics, a nonprofit that conducts essential research related to animal advocacy, maintains an online research library, and directly supports advocates and advocacy organizations in their work to improve the lives of animals. Faunalytics is a great organization, so I'm very excited that Sarah's here to talk about the work that they do and her tips for being a more effective wildlife advocate. Take it away, Sarah.
Thanks, Rachel. And hey, everybody. Let me share my screen. All right. Does this look good to everybody?
Yep, looks good. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Awesome. Okay. Well, thanks, Rachel, for the introduction. Again, my name is Sarah Hanneken, and I serve as legal advocacy counsel for the farm animal protection nonprofit Animal Equality. But today I'm primarily wearing my Faunalytics hat. I'm a member of the board of directors of this organization that really exists to support animal activists to use the most effective strategies and approaches to advocate for whatever category of animals is their focus. And so little plug here for Faunalytics. Our tagline, I think, is very straightforward and accurate. You know, we all are activists for animals, and in order to be the best activists we can be, we need empirical research to guide our actions. Otherwise, we risk just spinning our wheels in the mud and gaining zero traction. So not only am I going to be talking to you today about the importance of data for wildlife advocacy, I also want to introduce you to the free resource for advocates made available by Faunalytics. And so whether you're interested in protecting wildlife or improving conditions for farm animals or advocating for companion animals or animals in zoos and circuses, Faunalytics website is a tremendous resource for insights into all of these topics. And the insights for wildlife advocates that I'm going to be talking about today come from studies that are freely available on Faunalytics website. So I'll return to this at the end just to remind you about this resource, but just very briefly, if you go to faunalytics.org, you can easily browse for wildlife-related articles by using the drop-down menu or searching for specific topics by keyword. And again, all of the studies I'm going to talk about today that illustrate the importance of data for effective advocacy are from Faunalytics website. So when we say data is important for effective advocacy, what kind of data are we actually talking about? Well, wildlife advocacy, like all animal advocacy, encompasses a variety of social and life sciences in order to convince target audiences that conservation is important, and also to convince them what conservation programs should look like technically. So I'm going to give you some examples of studies that pull from these various disciplines to inform activities ranging from individual activism, changing hearts and minds, whether that's just of your neighbors or policymakers, to political activism and efforts to ensure that the policies we are able to win for wild animals are effectively implemented. So I'll start with studies that touch on effective techniques for engaging one-on-one or just with the public as individual advocates. So what research has been done that offers tips and tricks for changing hearts and minds? Principles from psychology and sociology shed light into how to educate the public on wildlife issues, as well as, what types of messaging are most effective. So here are some examples of different attitudinal studies and what the data from these studies tells us about being an effective wildlife advocate. So the first study I'll talk to you about is a study about how Wisconsin residents' attitudes towards wolves have changed over a period of about a decade. The research started in 2001 and ended in 2009. And researchers were curious, how attitudes shifted over this period and how that shift in attitudes coincided with different policy programs and the increase in wolf-human interactions. And unfortunately, researchers found an increase in fear of wolves and an increase in support for lethal wolf control methods. And this period, as I mentioned, coincided with an increasing abundance of wolves in the study participants area. And so the researchers also found that increase in the belief that wolves compete with hunters for deer, which is a very popular hunting species for recreational hunters in northern Wisconsin, which I happen to be from Wisconsin. So I can tell you I am familiar with the mentality. And even an increased inclination among residents to personally poach wolves. So really disturbing data, but important to know. And the researchers concluded that understanding these individual attitudes and how they predict overt opposition to predator conservation or direct covert action against predators is essential groundwork to help us recover and maintain protections for them. And sure enough, shortly after the study was conducted, a law was put into effect that actually, this is an aside, I worked on this lawsuit when I was at Animal Legal Defense Fund, a law that prevented activists from monitoring hunters, even on public lands. And so we actually are challenging that law on First Amendment grounds because filming on public lands is a First Amendment protected form of speech. So it's just interesting that law was widely supported and, attitudes that the study reflected kind of could have predicted that. So really important to keep our finger on the pulse of public attitudes, even as conservation efforts are successful, and especially as they're successful, actually. So the next study that also looked at attitudes towards various carnivores and omnivorous species took place in Europe and looked at how attitudes, again, changed over time. The researchers sought to determine how the presence of certain species might change attitudes, kind of as we saw in the previous study, and also just to better understand the different socio-demographic and cultural variables that seem to coincide with different attitudes. And so the researchers found that the proportion of people with positive attitudes towards wolves unfortunately decreased as duration of their coexistence increased. So once again, we're seeing examples of people finding it easier to hypothetically support large carnivores and other species when they don't have to deal with them directly. And specifically, 100% of wolf surveys and 87% of the bear surveys found that people who had experienced damage due to carnivores, or I guess bears are omnivores, but the researchers are just saying carnivores here, had more negative attitudes towards them. So that is not surprising, perhaps, but important to have a look at how prevalent this trend actually is. So the researchers concluded that for wild animal advocates, the time period when large carnivores begin to return to a given region after being threatened or endangered is absolutely critical for conservation, because public attitudes are likely to change once people start coexisting with animals like bears and wolves. And so it's at that time that local attitudes are most likely to start shifting downward, and conservationists need to be cognizant of them and take steps to counteract this anticipated negative shift. Because clearly implementation of successful conservation efforts, while that's most of our goals here, it's just not enough, because in order to maintain protections for these animals and prevent their numbers from backsliding, we need to continue to work to address local residents' concerns. Otherwise, we're just going to constantly see this pendulum swinging, where they become threatened, we implement protections, their numbers go up, local attitudes turn against them, and their protections are removed, numbers go down. So we want to prevent this pendulum trend. And then the final attitudinal study I'll talk about today is from a group of study participants in an urban setting. The researchers sought to discover people's current attitudes towards animal rights and welfare, and how those attitudes were formed, and also how receptive the participants were to changing those attitudes. I'll just note the study was not specific to wild animals, but all animals. But the findings are still super important for wildlife advocates. So all participants in the study began with the general belief that animals should be treated positively, should be protected to some degree, and afforded some measure of dignity. However, while all the participants seemed to care about the treatment of animals, at least in the abstract, they tended to be wary of implementing concrete protection measures, largely because they didn't understand them. And so to test the extent of the study participants' attitudes towards animals, they were invited to discuss the merits of individual animal welfare versus rights. In case you're not aware, there's some debate in the animal protection movement about whether we should be talking about welfare or rights, with rights being considered more philosophical and extreme in many circles, and welfare, by contrast, is more of a framework just simply concerned with ensuring humane conditions for animals, but not necessarily prohibiting human use of them for our own ends. Whereas animal rights suggests animals should have autonomy and should have moral standing in our society, just by virtue of their existence as sentient beings that have rights activists would say have as much of a right to their life as we do. So after exposing the study participants to the various welfare or rights-based messaging, the researchers found that participants were generally receptive to the idea of ensuring animal welfare, but were hesitant to embrace the concept of animal rights. And they found that participants presented with rights-based messaging remained unconvinced, in part because they had difficulty conceptualizing how animal rights would be established and protected. They kind of doubted the feasibility of implementing that type of framework within our society. So again, it came down to being unable to sort of envision what various concepts would look like in practice. So the researchers basically found that, protecting the rights of animals, including wild animals, may be the ultimate goals of many of us. We see them as being worthy of protection, again, mostly by virtue of their sentience, their autonomy as individuals, and we are on their land. This is a framework that is familiar to many of us, but not the wider public. The study tells us that the concept of animal rights still seems radical and unfeasible to much of the public. So the good news, though, is that there's widespread support for a welfare-oriented approach. So although simply ensuring welfare may fall short of the ultimate aim of some advocates who believe wild animals have a right to remain wild and thrive, we can make progress just by implementing welfare-oriented legal protections as a useful intermediate step. And so we can potentially engage people who are on the fence about these issues and help them identify with the wild animal protection movement by talking about protections in terms of welfare, in terms that they're comfortable with, whereas talk of wildlife rights might turn people off. So now I'll turn to the area of public policy. And just note that some of the same principles of psychology and sociology that I just discussed certainly also apply when talking to law and policymakers, since as human beings, they're just as susceptible to these common thought patterns as anybody else. But when we're talking about public policy, political advocacy, insights from biology and ecology also become especially important, since policymakers tend to be more interested than a layperson in specific scientific facts and empirical data, and maybe just more inclined to want to understand what that data looks like. Whereas emotion is potentially more important is important regardless of who you're talking to. But as I'm sure every one of us has encountered at some point, sometimes just hard facts do not move the average person, and you have to talk a little bit more in terms of feelings and emotions. So what does the data tell us about changing public policy? We know that sound scientific data forms the basis for designing the most successful government programs with conservation ends, and proof of these programs' efficacy can help secure political and financial support for future programs, either in the same area or in other jurisdictions. So one example of a study that found, that basically concluded the importance of working with policymakers and using data to support the replication of successful conservation programs elsewhere, looked at a particular threat that is contributing to the decline of red wolf species. The threat is essentially a hybridization with species that share the same geographical area. It's called genetic introgression. And this process dilutes the gene pool and can threaten genetic integrity of a species. So a study looked at 4 pairs of red wolves that were released into the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge in eastern North Carolina. And within 6 years, the wolves had successfully bred and reestablished themselves, but at the same time had done so in part by mating with coyotes in the same range. And so hybridization was occurring regularly. And this is obviously a problem if the goal is to maintain biodiversity by maintaining distinct species. And so scientists determined that a potential solution to this genetic introgression is the use of placeholder animals to stop hybridization. And it's really interesting. It takes the trap, neuter, release model for free roaming cats and applies it to coyotes or coyote wolf hybrids that are trapped, sterilized, and then released back into their communities and allowed to live out their lives and maintain their social bonds while helping to prevent the overall trend of genetic introgression. And researchers tested this theory, and in that same wildlife refuge where the red wolves were initially introduced, and found that a second go around of reintroducing red wolves with these sterilized coyotes as placeholder individuals found that the red wolf population was much more successful at reestablishing itself without as much hybridization, since interspecies breeding occurred far less often. And so the study concluded by basically saying that wild animal advocates will probably, find this approach intriguing, but just by the nature of it, like most conservation programs, activists cannot implement it by themselves. They need to get buy-in from government and conservation agencies, largely because a lot of these programs are applied on public lands and also require public funds. So having data that shows the success of a program in one area can really go a long way in convincing public policymakers elsewhere to fund and implement the program in their own jurisdictions. And then last but not least, I will talk about how data from biological and ecological studies are especially critical to ensure that existing wildlife protection statutes are effectively implemented. So we have, individual activism, talking to individuals to change hearts and minds, change negative attitudes towards species like wolves and coyotes and other predators. And then we have, public policy initiatives trying to get certain protections put in place. And then once those protections are put in place, we want to make sure that they're effectively implemented. And that's where biology and ecology data from studies in these areas really are important. And so it's because laws like the Endangered Species Act and the National Environmental Policy Act, which are absolutely critical for protecting wolves and other predator species, are really only as good as the regulations that implement them. But thankfully, Congress wrote many of these statutes to expressly require that agencies base their conservation decisions on the best available scientific data. And this is a critical safeguard against the use of so-called evidence for weaker regulations that we always see different industries providing to government regulators to try to get protections rolled back. Of course, industries have a vested interest in eliminating these protections if they prevent them from going in and extracting resources. So by requiring that regulators make decisions based on the best available scientific data is a safeguard against using, super biased or unsound research. And in the event that an agency does not abide by this guideline or this requirement, advocacy groups can bring litigation to undo unfavorable agency decisions. So here are two examples of cases that came out favorably for wild animals because the courts in these cases ruled that the agencies did not base their decisions on the best available science. So in this first one, American Wildlands, the agency had decided not to list a certain species of fish as endangered under the ESA and found that decision was unlawful because the Fish and Wildlife Service had failed to explain why it included hybrid individuals in its calculation of the existing population. And so the court said, it was unable to determine whether the service relied on the best scientific data available. And that was a violation of the Endangered Species Act. So the agency had to go back and relook at their decision not to list the species as a protected one. And then in Earth Island Institute, the Secretary of Commerce was chastised by the court for not rationally connecting his decision to allow certain tuna fishing in an important area for dolphins, that the secretary did not rationally connect that decision to the best available scientific evidence. The agency had used insufficient sample sizes, basically, and came out saying that they didn't think that the tuna fishing using these really big destructive nets the agency thought that wouldn't have a significant impact on the dolphins. And so this environmental group sued, and indeed the court said, yeah, you did not use robust enough data. You better go back and take another look at this. So again, this is where having strong data, or at least being able to identify when data is not strong, is really important in conservation efforts. So just to kind of wrap things up, we talked about effective messaging and public education. Insights into human attitudes and decision-making and behavior are really key to being an effective wildlife advocate, since changing attitudes and compelling certain decisions is really what advocacy is all about. The examples that I gave you suggest that it is particularly important, for instance, to educate the public about safely and harmoniously coexisting with wolves and other predator species, debunking myths that cause people to be fearful of wolves, and instilling in them a sense of pride and responsibility for species successes. The other study I talked about found that messaging around wild animals' welfare is more effective than talking about rights. Again, it's important to know what type of messaging creates different impressions in the listener's mind in order to be as effective as possible when talking to them about it. And then for folks working on public policy and effective implementation of laws, data is critical to convincing law and policymakers to enact different programs related to conservation, and empirical proof that a program has worked elsewhere can really go a long way to convince government officials to implement a similar program in their area. So it's also important to be aware of the evolving scientific research on various wild species conservation efforts, since regulators' decisions under laws like the Endangered Species Act thankfully must be based on the best available scientific data. And so it's worth noting that whenever there's an opportunity for the public comment on a proposed rule, any one of you, any member of the public, can submit relevant studies to the government agency, and they must consider them. So we want to make sure that agencies have all the scientific knowledge that's out there presented to them, and then they're required to consider it. And if they don't consider it, or if they disregard it for an arbitrary or capricious reason, groups can come in and sue and undo a harmful agency decision. So that is a brief overview of the importance of data for effective wildlife advocacy. And then I just remind you all about the resources available to you on faunaalytics.org. I encourage you to check out the website and explore. It's completely free, and we hope that you find it useful. Feel free to contact me anytime.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Sarah. That was great, as usual. I appreciate you bringing up the importance of using good data and sound scientific research. Would you? Sorry, I'm trying to read some of these questions. Especially that the Endangered Species Act says the decisions must be made using best available science. Would you recommend that advocates try to gather scientific articles such as those that can be found via Faunaalytics prior to attending State Fish and Wildlife Commission meetings, or perhaps even send those commissioners those articles?
Sure, yeah, I'll stop sharing my screen so I can properly talk to you all. Yeah, so it kind of depends on what the purpose of the hearing is. Generally, it's good to be, armed with all the available data before going to those hearings. Although if the meeting or hearing is more about like introducing a topic, usually it'll be, I would say usually hearings are taking place in the middle or towards the end of a policymaking process. So at that point, you kind of know where the agency is headed, and then you can gather data appropriately. So I guess I would agree with the former position. Yeah, arm yourselves with as much as you can. In terms of submitting it to the agency or the regulatory body, it really depends on what agency we're talking about and what type of decision they're trying to make. Certainly any federal agency that is making a wildlife decision is going to have to abide by these federal laws like the Endangered Species Act or the National Environmental Policy Act. And that those decisions often have, like I said, offer public opportunity for public comment. So you can submit studies directly to the agencies through the different agencies' websites. And yeah, but in terms of other, like maybe more local government bodies that are having hearings, it depends, because they don't have to abide by the same statutes as the federal agencies do. But there are many states that have kind of state level analogs to some of these federal statutes that also go through a similar process where, public comment is welcomed, and then you can submit studies to agencies.
Thank you. There's another question. Does Faunaalytics get involved or submit comments with data in some state issues that involve misinformation?
Yeah, so Faunaalytics mostly just makes the studies available to activists, and then relies on the different advocacy groups to submit those studies and do the interfacing with the public agencies. So yeah, Faunaalytics, like I said, we support activists, but we don't do a whole lot of active advocacy ourselves.
Is there another question here? Is there a central source that you might find most reliable for scientific papers that are either peer reviewed or in the process of peer review? I feel like Funalytics has a bunch of those on their website, actually.
Yeah, Funalytics, I mean, I think they're mostly all peer reviewed. If it is, it'll say so. If it's not, it probably will also say so. So Funalytics is a great resource. I mean, if you have subscriptions to other research databases like Hein Online or JSTOR or ResearchGate, there's a whole bunch of them out there, but you have to pay for them. So that's part of why Funalytics tries to make at least summaries of studies available for free for advocates.
Yeah, I certainly do. As someone that visits that site frequently, I certainly do appreciate those summaries and links to the articles. I find it very helpful. Okay, we've got a question about, oh, sorry, that one disappeared. Oh, there we go. What are your thoughts on the Endangered Species Act being reestablished for wolves?
I mean, my personal thoughts as an activist are, that I think that's a positive thing. I think, the more, just because I'm pro-conservation and I don't tend to be as concerned with, private industry, losing profits. They make enough profits as it is, in my personal opinion. So I think they can, spare some land and resources for others. But yeah, I mean, as a practical matter, policymakers are going to weigh these different considerations when it comes to listing or delisting a species. And yeah, I mean, I guess I say I am all for protections, but again, sometimes the best available data actually will say that protections aren't necessary. And when that's the case, then I guess that means that conservation programs have been successful. And yeah, I mean, judges have said, and I'm sure regulators have also said, that when it comes to the Endangered Species Act, the goal is to not have species listed forever as endangered or threatened, because we're trying to bring them back to robust population sizes. And so, yeah, a time might come for wolves or other species that they no longer need to be listed. And if, there's actually data that says that, yeah, they'll be fine without these protections, well, then that's the way the act was designed to be implemented. So I would support that.
I think that's a difficult reminder for us sometimes as advocates, the idea that we really want these wolves to be protected, but in some areas they are doing really well, which then means, of course, then their protections go down. It's it seems this kind of a yo-yo effect.
Yeah.
It's not fair to the animals, but it's what we're stuck with at the moment, and it's
right
to swallow.
Yeah, well, and that's why I highlighted those various studies that talked about, okay, what do you do? What interventions can advocates take when population numbers are going back up? Because that's when, local residents the protections might be taken away, and then local residents are interacting with these animals on a more frequent basis and developing these negative attitudes towards them. And so, especially when we see protections being rolled back and population numbers going back up, that, advocates need to kind of switch gears to public education and supporting programs that will allow for harmonious coexistence, just so that we can try to protect those newly established animals from the animosity of local hunters and others that would rather not have them around.
I have certainly seen that in the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife Commission meetings. There's all these more and more cougars and wolves are being seen, at least in some areas, which of course leads to people having the negative attitudes, just like you mentioned. And I do wish we could convince our own departments to do more of the outreach that so desperately needs to be done.
Mhm.
It does seem that we are so often in those agencies that say that their wildlife management are really managing human beings and
Yeah,
not the animals themselves.
yeah, it's accurate.
Okay, I think that is all the questions that we have now. I just want to remind folks that this presentation will be available on our YouTube channel. And I really appreciate you doing this presentation. I know that sometimes talking about data can be a little dry for some folks, but
Yeah.
I find it interesting. And it's so vital for us to be using this information for our important work. And calling back to the previous presentation, Erica's talking about, how to be a good lobbyist. And if we can go to our reps with all of this information, I think that just strengthens our argument about why these animals need that advocacy work. So thank you.
Exactly. Yeah. Emotion-laden rhetoric only goes so far. And especially with policymakers. So yeah, lobbying, well armed with hard facts is much more effective than if you just go in and say, I care about this issue, protect these animals because I like them. That's not going to be very persuasive. So that's where we need data.